Does anybody figure out what's really going on with waste, fraud, and abuse and just plain bad ideas in California state government? Maybe even more important question, does anybody figure out solutions to these kind of things? Actually, the answer is yes, and you're going to find that out today on this episode of Independent Conversations. Welcome, everybody. I'm Graham Walker, coming to you today from the Independent Institute in Oakland, California. I'm delighted to have everyone join us today to talk about California government and a very remarkable program that we have here at the Independent Institute called the California Golden Fleece Award Program. So I've got a number of my colleagues here who know a great deal about this, and this is the California Golden Fleece Award team. Let me start with Lawrence McQuillan. Dr. Lawrence McQuillan, welcome, Lawrence.
Hello, Graham. Nice to be with you.
You are a PhD economist. Am I correct about that?
Yes, correct. George Mason University.
So he knows a great deal about figuring out how things really work. Also happy to have with us our colleague, Adam Summers. Welcome, Adam.
Hey, Graham. Good to be here.
I think you've got quite a background in investigative journalism. Am I right about that?
Well, I worked for the Orange County Register for several years and all of their sister newspapers, of course, in Southern California News Group. I worked in the opinion section as an editorial writer and a columnist.
And we are grateful to have you as part of our team. Turning to Jonathan Hofer. Jonathan, I know, is a fairly recent graduate from UC Berkeley. Jonathan, you've got some research under your belt, too.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you for having me. I studied political science at the University of California, Berkeley, and I'm a research associate at the Independent Institute.
And great to have you, too. So let's talk about the California Golden Fleece Award Program. I think this was your brainchild at one point. Lawrence, is that right? How did you get the idea and get it going?
That's correct. When I was a kid, there was a senator from Wisconsin, United States Senator William Proxmire, who started something called the Golden Fleece Awards, where he exposed waste, fraud, and abuse at the federal government level. And he did that for many years, 1975 through 1988. And about 20 years ago, I was reading a profile about his career where they mentioned the Golden Fleece Awards that he had done. And I was thinking, why not do that for California? Because it's such a target-rich environment. And it also drew a lot of media attention. I can remember when I was a kid, it would be on the radio and on television. So I thought, why not repeat that for California? So about 20 years ago, we started the California Golden Fleece Awards. And we did that for a number of years. But as usually happens, life gets busy, other projects take over, and it sat dormant for about 10 years until I joined the Independent Institute, and I was asked if I wanted to revive it again. And I said, sure. It was a good idea. And of course, California still has a lot of problems. So we're never short on targets to feature. So we started it up again.
Target-rich environment in California.
So we started it in 2016, and it's been going forward ever since.
So what I love about this program, Lawrence, is that it isn't just an award, just like giving somebody a black eye. As far as I have understood, every time you issue a quote-unquote award, I mean, it's a satirical award, but you've also got serious research behind it that you also publish. It's not just like a bozo prize. You do written reports with deep research.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we basically, I try to find things that satisfy two different factors. The one is it well documented? Can it be verified? So oftentimes I'll get phone calls from people saying, alleging that this program is engaged in misconduct and there's waste, fraud, and abuse going on. But when I ask them to send me proof, they can't do it. So the first factor that we want to satisfy is make sure that it can be documented and verified. And then the second thing that we use to decide which fleeces we're going to award is it nonpartisan? In other words, does it affect people across the political spectrum? So, for example, if you're waiting hours and hours at the Department of Motor Vehicles to get something done, it doesn't matter if you're a Republican or Democrat, you're going to be inconvenienced. Or if a wildfire is headed for your house, the fire doesn't know if you're libertarian or independent. So what we try to do is pick things that affect everybody across the political spectrum and that have a wide impact on people, and that everybody, pretty much no matter where you sit on the political spectrum and what your political affiliation is, would see this as a valid issue to go after. And also, as you mentioned, I mean, the reports are very detailed. If you're interested in reading like the opinion page of a newspaper, you'll enjoy reading our reports. They're very accessible, yet they're detailed enough so you come away with a very broad understanding of the factors that are driving the problem.
We don't just make you mad, we make you smart.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's one of the great things about it. And going back to your first point, Lawrence, the fact that you won't go to print or go public until you actually have an evidential basis is really important. I applaud you for that. So let's talk about some of these Golden Fleece awards, Golden Fleece reports. Can I start with the one you mentioned a minute ago? Wildfires affects everybody. I mean, thank goodness in the past couple of years we've had more rain in California, but boy, we were having just horrible orange-brown skies for weeks at a time, even in Northern California. Your investigation showed that some public policies and public agencies could have done a dramatically better job in advance. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, we've done 2 reports on the wildfire issue here in California. One focused more on CAL FIRE, the department that oversees the response to wildfires and mitigation of wildfires, prevention of wildfires. And that was one report. And then we did a second follow-up report, which probably got actually more attention because it focused on solutions and recommendations for reforms. And just to give you background on how we do these reports, we try to provide a menu of reform options. Some of them are very minor tweaks that would generally get widespread consensus that we need to adopt them. And then some are more kind of radical ideas, usually centered around changing the property rights regime to have people who are most affected by the problem be able to respond and solve the problem. So we always provide like a menu of options here in terms of reforms. And for wildfires, we tackled this issue, years before these reforms were adopted, but we suggested things like more controlled burns, more undergrounding of transmission lines, stronger power poles using steel rather than wood, more cameras, especially cameras that have night vision capability, infrared capability to pick up wildfires more quickly. And another one was more nighttime wildfire fighting capabilities. So, for example, to invest more in Nighthawk helicopters, which can fight fires at night when humidity levels generally go up and winds go down, and it's easier to tackle them. So all of these ideas that we first initiated in the report have since been adopted either as law or as policy reforms or as spending priorities by the California state government.
Even the one about controlled burns?
Right. Yes. There's much more going on now in terms of controlled burns. Let me preface by saying, of all of these recommendations, none of them are being, implemented at the scale that we'd like to see them be implemented at. But yes, there's more controlled burns today than there used to be. It's easier to get permits.
That's a huge difference.
Yeah, and they're sectioning off the state and having more targeted burns in areas that with the highest risk of future wildfires. So more of that is being done, and they've bought 6. They being the state of California have bought 6 helicopters for dropping fire retardant at night, and so they have invested in virtually everything we recommended. The only thing it took them years to get to the point
Right,
where
right.
we were recommending it much earlier, and it should have been done much sooner.
It's pretty
You know,
encouraging.
there's another aspect to the wildfire policy issue that we addressed in the report that I really haven't seen discussed in detail elsewhere, and that's the element of housing. And there are so many more people moving into the wildlife urban interface, you know, in these rural and semi-rural areas that are more forested or have a lot of chaparral and so forth. And that's because the housing is more affordable there. So even when you have these state and local policies addressing housing, that affects the wildfire issue because you're driving up prices and forcing people to move further and further out. And I won't get too much into it because we did a separate report on housing. I'm sure we'll talk
Well,
about that a little bit more later.
maybe we should jump there right now because that's a pretty interesting overlap. I mean, the fact is that housing is so expensive in California. People are desperate to find places in state or sometimes out of state, obviously, where they can afford it. Some people say, well, it's because there are these big bad landowners and development companies that want to jack up the prices. You guys did some serious research on housing, which led to some other conclusions. I don't know which of you is best to talk about that, but I'd love to hear more about the Housing Golden Fleece Award report.
Well, I'll kick it off, and then Adam can jump in. That's an excellent point. I mean, there's actually a phrase for that: "Drive until you qualify" is the phrase that's often used. You know, you have to go out further and further until you can qualify for a loan and
In
afford
California,
the house.
that means you keep driving east.
Yeah, exactly. And you get into more wildfire areas.
And then
But
you
yeah,
can't get insurance.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So probably the most popular report that we did was on housing and restrictions and barriers to developing housing in California that has increased the price of housing and rents here in California. And so we focused on several recommendations in that report that have since been adopted, but again, not at the scale that we'd like to see them be adopted. For example, we suggested more upzoning or rezoning of land to allow for more denser housing construction in areas of California, more streamlined permitting, more exemptions to the California Environmental Quality Act, for example. All of those things to a greater or lesser extent have happened, but not at the scale that needs to happen. So unfortunately, if you look at the numbers in terms of housing starts, it's been pretty flat. Even with these recent reforms, they haven't really jump-started the housing market like politicians have said that they would. And we've always been asking for, to do bigger and bolder things than what's been going on here in California.
I mean, it sounds like to me a lot of the reforms that were in your report had to do with making it more viable to build residential housing. I mean, after all,
Right.
if people can make money building residential housing, especially at the low end, then there's going to be more residential housing.
Right. I mean, kind of in a nutshell, the problem with California is there's too many individuals and groups of people who can veto any proposed housing development in California using these various measures like zoning, permitting, CEQA, the Environmental Act, things like that, where they can strategically interject themselves into the process and either completely shut down a housing development project or slow it to the extent that people just give up and leave. They just walk away from the project. And I mean, Adam has written a lot on that, talked a lot about that. So yeah, Adam can give more details on that.
Sure. Well, of course, anytime you restrict the supply through zoning, urban growth boundaries, and these sorts of things, or if you just increase the cost of building housing, whether it's through union pay scales, project labor agreements, and so forth, that drives up labor costs significantly, or affordable housing mandates where they say you have to have a certain percentage of the units in your development go for below market rates, or you have to pay a certain in lieu fee to the government so that they can spend it on housing. Whenever you make those things less profitable, of course, you're going to get less housing. And that's what we've been
But
seeing.
people feel the opposite on that, and they think, well, if you force these developers to carve out bits for low-cost housing, then there'll be more low-cost housing. But you're saying there's a paradoxical boomerang effect?
Well, sure, and that's why about the only development that you do see tends to be in the luxury market, expensive areas, because they still have a little bit of profit margin. They can afford some of those costs, but at the lower end of the spectrum, it's hard to build anything you would consider affordable because the builders are just priced out of the market.
And also on the lower end, you have, for example, in rental units, you have then rent control, eviction moratoriums, various ways to prevent bad tenants from being removed. And as a result, as Adam was just mentioning, I mean, you reduce the amount of people then who want to offer up property as rental units in California, because they know that once they bring in a tenant, if it doesn't work out, it's impossible. Sometimes it takes years to get rid of the person, and oftentimes they can live there for free, rent free in the meantime. So it's the laws are really skewed against people wanting to introduce more properties onto the rental market in California, and it should be just the opposite. We should be encouraging it.
I'd be afraid to be a landlord, because if you invest in the property and then suddenly they slap rent control on, you're going to be stuck. And if you have, difficult tenants, you can't evict them. I mean, I just steer clear of it. And that means there's going to be a lot less rental housing available if people who could do it steer clear of it.
Or if someone threatens a CEQA lawsuit, and quite oftentimes it's for reasons that have nothing to do with the environment.
CEQA stands for?
Well, Lawrence mentioned it earlier, the California Environmental Quality Act. And it basically allows people multiple bites at the apple to kill projects and require very expensive and time-consuming environmental reports. And so if you're a developer and you don't want to spend 10 or 15 years fighting in court to try to get your development going and spending millions, maybe tens or hundreds of millions of dollars to try to satisfy whatever the requirements are for reports, or essentially kind of blackmailed into providing greater amenities or whatever the case may be. In some cases, you might even have governments that kind of blackmail the developer into providing more road infrastructure or something, or parks or whatever.
Well, Adam, I mean, the thing is, don't you care about the environment? And besides, nobody could bring a CEQA action to prevent a development unless they had like a legitimate reason, right?
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, that's not the case. And most, the vast majority, in fact, of the CEQA lawsuits involve properties that are what's considered an infill development. That is, they're surrounded by other development. It's not, you're causing severe harm to the environment because you're going out in the pristine environment to start a new development or something. These are already developments taking place, in places where lots of people live. And so there are very few, there tend to be very few environmental impacts, but that doesn't prevent people who don't want any development going in from using the law as a cudgel.
So you could use it for almost any excuse. You can file a CEQA complaint on a development. Is that right?
You can, yeah, including shadows, for example.
Oh my!
If a new development is expected to cast a shadow on your property or your park.
And you're talking figuratively, literally, not figuratively.
Literally, yeah, and also things like noise that were never intended to be part of CEQA. If recently a new dormitory at the University of California, Berkeley was gone through this ordeal of trying to get passed and through the CEQA laws, and it was being delayed based on the theory that students are noisy and they're going to cause environmental noise pollution to the neighboring community. I mean, I don't think it's any news that students can be noisier than adults or seniors, but that was enough to kill the project initially until the state of California legislature actually passed an exemption just for this new dorm construction project.
And they'll pass exemptions for Sacramento sports teams and things that they like, but everyone else has to go through this.
So
gauntlet.
As a result of your work on that, did you contribute to any effort to like give more general exemptions from the CEQA restrictions? Any progress on that front?
Yes, there are some new laws now that exempt, like, for example, homelessness shelters, affordable housing projects don't have to go through the CEQA process anymore. As Adam mentioned, there's also statutory exemptions for, like, football stadiums have been really common. Other sports arena like the Sacramento Kings, relatively new arena in Sacramento, the Golden One Center got an exemption.
Oh, yeah.
So there's things like that. It hasn't been, what I would like to see is broaden it out even more, like what Adam was talking about, how 80 to 90% of these lawsuits deal with infill projects, not greenfield projects. So they're not talking about building something in a previously pristine, green, forested area. These are things that are right in the middle of urban neighborhoods with buildings and cars and buses and construction all around. And so having an exemption, I think, a permanent exemption by the legislature for all landfill or infill projects would be a huge improvement. I'd like to see that go through.
And there have been governors, from both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democratic governors for years have been calling for CEQA reform. So it's not necessarily a partisan issue. I believe it was, Arnold Schwarzenegger and Jerry Brown and
Duke
Majan, maybe. I think they did a joint op-ed to the Sacramento Bee calling for CEQA reform. And
good for them,
Jerry Brown famously said, "CEQA reform is the Lord's work." So he wasn't able to get some significant reforms done in his time, unfortunately. There are some pretty powerful entrenched environmental interests.
Now, there are some other...
environmental, because as we discussed, a lot of these things don't actually affect the environment very much at all.
Right. Yeah, you can file a CEQA lawsuit anonymously. And oftentimes, the people who file these suits, they have absolutely no interest in the environment. They're not environmentalists. They're just people, they're NIMBY people who perhaps live in the neighborhood, or just NIMBYs in general who are anti-population, who want to keep projects from being built. And they file these lawsuits, and there's no connection whatsoever to the environment most of the time.
Now, one last thing. I think, Lawrence McQuillan, you have proposed, and it was in your Housing Golden Fleece report, what I consider the mother of all solutions to the housing crisis in California, which would be a constitutional amendment, which would tell us what it would do.
Well, yeah, I call it a right to build amendment, which would be essentially a right to build residential property if you satisfy very basic minimal health and safety standards. And you also provide public notice to the surrounding community of what your plans are. You'd post the plans. It would give the community time to talk with the developer to change things that they don't like about it voluntarily. But it would get rid of all of this permitting red tape and zoning red tape and other obstacles like CEQA. I mean, you could still file environmental lawsuits, but it would be based on real damages that the community suffered as a result of the project, either while it was being built or after the fact. But you wouldn't have all of these preemptive lawsuits that can kill these projects based on all of these silly reasons that have absolutely nothing to do with the environment. So it'd be a radical way of streamlining and shifting the property rights back from all of these stakeholders that now can kill these projects left and right, back to private property owners that can decide what they want to do with their property. And if they want to build residential units on this property at any price point, they can choose whatever price point they want. And just build is the only real way out of this problem. In the end, is just to build your way out of it and allow developers to build across the price spectrum at all of these various price points. And eventually we'll get out of this crisis that we're in today.
So you heard it here first, folks. California Golden Fleece Award recommended a right to build constitutional amendment. So stand by, hopefully, for progress on that. Could we talk about water? I mean, a few years ago, The Oroville Dam, oh man, it nearly inundated a whole town, right? You guys did some
Right.
research on that.
Right. Yeah. This was back in, 2016, 2017, when we had a huge amount of water and the Oroville Dam nearly had a total collapse. I mean, it came so close to having a total failure. And as a result, we investigated what was the reasons for the problems with the dam. Many of them dated back to the original construction of it. So what the old rule was, or the old practice was, is that they used a lot of people who were former employees of the California Department of Water Resources. So they got very cozy, favorable inspections, and they weren't getting like the independent, in-depth inspections that were required. So they did pass new rules and regulations that require independent outside inspectors that have no either current or past connection with the California Department of Water Resources. And the inspection reports now are made available to the public. So they're all much more transparent process. The other thing that we recommended was a lot more electronics and sensors around the dam and also on the spillway to capture more quickly if a problem occurs. So now, for example, when they rebuilt the entire main spillway and they put in more than 100 different sensors that now give them real-time feedback about what's happening, both on top of the dam and on the sides and underneath. And so that was another recommendation that we made in our report that was subsequently adopted. But again, this is years later when they did this, unfortunately. So the Golden Fleece Awards has a real pattern of getting ahead and providing recommendations well before the politicians get involved.
Well, anybody who lives near a dam, thanks you for what you
absolutely.
did there. Next subject. So everybody hates dealing with the Department of Motor Vehicles, but if I'm not mistaken, last time I did my renewal, it just seemed a little faster and a little more streamlined. Am I right?
Right, yeah. When we did the report on the California Department of Motor Vehicles, this is no exaggeration. It would literally take hours and hours for people to get through the lines and get whatever they needed done, completed. People would bring literally camping gear to sit out in front of the DMV and form lines, including coolers and boom boxes and you name it. They would be in there for the entire day.
So part of what happened, I think, is the DMV took seriously your suggestion for outsourcing to other kind of third parties. How does that work now?
Right. I mean, one of our recommendations was to allow people to do more of their services at third-party vendors like AAA, for example, or kiosks at grocery stores, things like that. And that has been implemented, and now you can do more of these services away from DMV offices. And if your preference is to do it online completely, that's also an option where you don't have to go into these offices anymore.
Well, it's kind of like the post office allows you to do, some very simple kind of mailing services at, local gift shop, Hallmark shop or UPS or whatever.
It's like, utilizing technology to get with the modern world for your government services. That's a pretty good thing. I think California should be like the showcase for the use of high tech in government services. But I think you guys did some research showing that California doesn't do as well as people think when it comes to using high tech for government.
No, and it is, as you say, kind of shocking that, Sacramento is a 2-hour drive or so from Silicon Valley. And yet for years and years and years, decades, really, we've been having problems with modernizing the IT software and programs in a variety of different governmental departments. The impetus for this was I would just see these news reports and I'd be like, didn't we just have something like that a couple of years ago? And yeah, sure enough, there have been a number of state auditors' office reports, condemning the various administrations for the running of their IT programs, and it just keeps happening over and over. And I was like, we've got to do something on this because obviously nothing's getting fixed. And so there have been a number of examples of this. One of those state auditors reports, I believe it was 2015, talked about how there were about 7 different IT programs that had been either canceled altogether or suspended over a period of about 10 or 15 years. And this had been at a cost of $1 billion. And so we've seen it, as I say, over and over again, sometimes, hundreds of millions of dollars per project, and they don't work. There are a number of reasons for this. A lot of it is poor contract management. In some cases, there was just a lack of oversight. In other cases, there were problems that were identified, but nothing was ever acted upon to actually try to fix those problems. And so it seems that the state has a problem with its contract management, and they really need to start incorporating more performance-based contracts to shift some of the risk to the contractors of these projects rather than the taxpayers, and just letting these draw out for years and years and rack up millions of dollars in waste and extra costs.
So what's really blocking modernization of the state's IT system? Briefly, what is it?
Well, as I said, some of it is contract management. Some of it is just kind of the inherent differences between private sector and public sector management. You have a lot more incentives to watch your costs and make sure that things actually do work in the private sector. And when they don't, there tend to be consequences because there's a lot of the company's money on the line.
Which is why I went the other day to AAA rather than to DMV to do some of my business.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, if a private company was trying to do their own IT system or contract with some other company and they were having problems and for various performance issues and they couldn't resolve it, they would figure it out really quickly because they'd see how much money they're losing, and they would probably fire that contractor, find someone else to do it, or find another solution. But in the public sector, when you're just dealing with not your own money, but taxpayers' money, there isn't that incentive to try to figure out what those problems are and to fix them in a timely manner.
What did you recommend to fix?
Well, part of it is we need to they need to get someone in there, and this might not be a government employee, and they might have to contract out for someone that has contract expertise, just so that we get some more responsible management of some of these projects. And you really need to hold people accountable. There are civil service protections that make that very difficult at the state government level. So some reforms there could help. But yeah, it is kind of an embarrassment. We've got these projects like there was a court case management system that was originally estimated at $33 million. And it was a very worthy project. It was this would have affected all 58 superior courts in the state. And it would have provided court information more easily to judges and law enforcement. And it would have also helped people, individuals access court information, make online payments, file documents electronically, and so forth. And so, again, very worthy project, but they just had a bear of a time trying to figure out how to implement it. So this was supposed to originally wrap up. It started in 2003. I think it was supposed to wrap up in 2009. By 2012, 3 years after that date, the cost estimates had risen from $33 million to $1.9 billion.
Wow.
So at this point, the state had spent about $500 million and finally just decided this isn't going to work, and they just killed the project.
Wow.
So we see a number of projects like this where they might be partially implemented and then they just kind of give up.
Adam, question. Are governments in California, both state and local governments, more at risk for ransomware? Have they been really juicy targets by hacker groups to go after, or because of the outdated IT, I'm thinking?
Well, actually, it's funny you mentioned that. I mean, some of the IT goes back to the 1960s and 70s, and some of the departments like the Employment Development Department, DMV, the State Controller's Office, which handles payroll and so forth. And so that's kind of scary. In a weird way, it might actually offer some protection from ransomware because the technology is so old.
What a
But it's
paradoxical
also,
point.
it's also extremely costly to maintain because it's hard to find parts or people with the knowledge of, old COBOL-based systems and so forth.
Oh,
So,
man.
but
Yikes.
yes, ransomware and other hacking is an increasingly significant and serious threat, no matter where you are, private sector, public sector, and we have seen some both in the public and private sector be targets of that. I think state government has been pretty lucky so far, but that's certainly a threat. The state auditor every year puts out what they think are the high risk issues facing the state, and the state's IT infrastructure has been on that list for quite a while, and that's one of the reasons. Another reason is, for example, with the financial reporting, they've really struggled. There was a project started back in 2005 called the Financial Information System for California, or FISCAL, and they had to make it kind of a cutesy little name, and they replaced the S in the acronym with a $sign. Perhaps to represent how much of the taxpayers' money they were going to waste on this project.
Yikes.
But in any case, this project dragged out for over 15 years, cost more than $1 billion in the end. And they didn't even fully implement it. They basically just kind of moved the goalposts and said, well, some of this functionality that we said we were going to do, we're just going to kind of push that off, and maybe we'll make that an extra budget expenditure later on. So they just kind of declared victory and before they had done what they said they were going to do.
Well, I'm grateful that you raised the red flag on these kind of things. And I can just hope that, as California moves forward, our public servants and policymakers will take a look at this California Golden Fleece Award report on state information technology.
Well, I think they'll have to. If I could just make one other point, I think they will get some more outside pressure from the financial world, if nothing else.
I would think, yeah.
Particularly with regard to the financial reporting, the state's annual comprehensive financial reports, which Wall Street relies on for bond ratings and so forth. That's been late for 5 years now, and I think we're running almost 2 years behind schedule currently. And so the state auditor has said, this is a real risk because if Wall Street can't get a good idea of what the state's finances are, it could end up lowering the bond rating, which would increase the costs that California has to pay every time it issues bonds, and those could be very significant.
Yeah. Well, okay, so California may have trouble with its state IT, but certainly, turning to you, Jonathan Hofer, certainly one area where there's a total high-tech panacea has got to be these great new automatic license plate readers, right? Can you tell us how successful the Alpers have been?
Yeah, certainly. One thing that I always tell people is that since the Edward Snowden leaks, I think people have the idea that government surveillance is kind of this ethereal thing that lives on the internet, and they probably don't interact with it much. But in reality, the number one surveillance tool in existence today are automated license plate readers within our very cities. They've been the most common surveillance tool since about 2019. They've been out in the wild since the 1970s. They start in the United Kingdom principally for purposes of toll bridges, but since the mid-2000s, American police have readily adopted these cameras, which are effectively high-speed cameras that read the alphanumeric characters on the license plate for purpose of tracking these vehicles. And they have exploded throughout the United States. Virtually every single metropolitan in the U.S. Now has some of these in various cities somewhere.
And California, right?
Yeah, especially in California. San Francisco, the peninsula area, probably has roughly 1,000 of these cameras. And Los Angeles County has roughly the same.
So, Jonathan, they know where I'm driving.
Yeah, with enough cameras, these ALPRs are able to determine with reasonable accuracy the direction and speed of your car. And what makes
Wow.
them particularly concerning from a civil liberties perspective is that not only can you tell where a car is at a given point in time, but these cameras record the historical data and whereabouts of an individual's
Oh
car.
my goodness.
And
So,
what
but I'm
people,
okay, right? Because I never go anywhere I shouldn't go, and I never drive over the speed limit, so I have nothing to worry about.
one would hope, yeah, hopefully. It's one of those things that people don't quite realize, that their driving patterns are very similar to a fingerprint of sorts. We can determine with pretty good accuracy which individual is inside the car based on their historical travel patterns. These cameras have been used to stalk individuals. They've been used to blackmail patrons of perhaps less than reputable bars, things like that.
But who has access to the data that could misuse it that way? I mean, surely they wouldn't misuse the data because it's in the hands of the government.
Yeah, the California especially has had a poor record with keeping control of their records. There is a positive trend that this data is restricted to licensed officials within police departments, and access is restricted. However, due to various intelligence sharing arrangements, this information can be disseminated amongst various agencies, could be collected by private individuals, and so forth.
Wow. So in your California Golden Fleece report on the subject, did you find ways to suggest, minimizing the downsides of these license plate readers and benefiting to some degree from them?
Yeah, certainly. To maximize their effectiveness and also to minimize their risk to civil liberties, the best thing that cities can do is to just regularly audit their data and keep a short retention period. And so that's for how long they keep the data on a car's whereabouts.
Mm-hmm.
Cities like Alameda in the Bay Area have done a tremendous job at implementing this, and I'm optimistic that cities will similarly adopt policies like Alameda's. But they range. They're not really universal yet. Some cities do a very poor job, such as Los Angeles.
Poor job at guarding the data, you mean? Or
poor job guarding the data. They keep
Uh-huh.
it for a minimum of like 5 years.
Oof,
They
that's a long
don't.
time.
Yeah, they don't clean the data, things like that.
Did you tell me once that the City Council of Berkeley in Northern California was reviewing its policy on this? And did you have any input on that?
Yeah, so I did a case study on Piedmont's license plate readers, which is a neighboring city to Berkeley, California, and showed that they have minimal effectiveness to police in regards to recovering stolen vehicles. And this information was used to inform Berkeley City Council vote. I believe they're having another vote shortly as well.
Well, keep up the good work. I mean, I can see why people like the idea, but wow, the downside is just very disturbing. Once again, California Golden Fleece report to the rescue. One more thing that I would like to talk about before we say goodbye for today. I was thinking about research you've done more recently on gas prices. Anybody who drives cross state lines from California knows that when you cross over into another state, gas prices drop. So what's up with that, and what are you doing about it?
Right. Our forthcoming Golden Fleece report will be on why California has persistently higher retail gas prices than other states. And so it's very narrowly focused, but it's on an issue that comes up all the time when people go to the gas station or they visit from another state, and they're shocked by how much they're having to pay for gas in California. So typically, California is about $1.20 to $1.50 higher than the national average, but it can spike up to as high as $2, even close to $3 higher than the national average at times. So we wanted to find out, why is this happening, and why is it so consistent and persistent over time? And so we narrowed it down basically to 3 factors that are driving the higher prices in California rather than what you see in other states. The first is the state excise tax, which is the second highest In America, it's about 58 cents per gallon of gasoline. But also
Wow.
California also loads on other state and local taxes as well. It has a state sales tax that applies to gasoline. Some local areas have their own local sales taxes and other fees. So when you add all that in, California has by far the highest taxes on gasoline of any state. So of course that's a major
Well, no
factor.
wonder.
That
No
accounts for
wonder.
about 26% or about a quarter of the difference between California and other states. Another
Uh-huh.
35% of the difference is accounted for by refinery costs in California, which tend to be higher, primarily for a couple reasons. One is that there aren't any oil and gas pipelines into California. There's a few that lead out of California to Nevada and Arizona, but there's none that go into California. So if there's a disruption to a refinery in California, you need more oil or gasoline to respond to that disruption. You're going to have to get it by ship because there are no pipelines. And that's more
And why are there
expensive.
why are there no pipelines?
For environmental reasons, it's just over time. Environmentalists have been successful at blocking them or preventing them or closing them down in some situations. So they're seen as, environmentally destructive or
So
potentially.
they've got these big ships belching smoke in the oceans to bring us
Right. Right. So
crude
you
oil.
have to
Then you also have
go ahead.
the cap and trade costs too, right? That are passed
Right.
on to
Well,
consumers.
that's
in
the
end.
third factor. Yeah. So, but the refinery costs are mainly, to import the oil from elsewhere by ship. And there's something called the Jones Act, which says that if you're going to ship something between U.S. ports in the United States, you have to use U.S. ships under U.S. flags manned by
Oh, I've heard
U.S.
of this.
crews, which also increases the cost because you just can't go out and find the cheapest tanker available. You have to use U.S. ships, so that it's much more expensive that way as well. And the other refinery costs that driver is the fact that we have unique fuel blends that are used in California, again for environmental reasons that attempt to hold down carbon emissions and other pollutants when the gasoline is burned, for example. So again, you just can't go outside the state and buy oil or gas anywhere. If you have any kind of disruption to supply, you have to get it from certain sources that then can comply with the environmental regulations at the refinery level. So those are the first two main drivers. And then the third one, as Adam mentioned, are various environmental regulations. Again, as some I already mentioned in terms of the fuel blend, but there's other cap and trade, the low carbon fuel standard. There's all these various regulations that apply to California, pollutants and emissions that don't apply in a lot of other states. So again, we pay extra for that, and that drives the price up about 40 to 45%. That accounts for
Wow.
40 to 45% of the difference. So if you add it all up, it comes down to taxes, environmental regulations, and this kind of fuel island effect that California has created for itself based on the fact that you just can't go out in the market and buy oil and gas from other suppliers if there is a disruption. So we kind of we put ourselves on an island where other parts of the country, they're much more integrated with the overall market. So if there's a disruption somewhere, they can go out and just pipe gasoline or oil into their market from other sources, especially the Midwest is much more well integrated with the overall market, whereas California has really set itself onto this island. And as a result, we pay a lot higher consistently than other states for gasoline at the pump.
So your report has some pretty clear recommendations, therefore, reduce that island effect, which would not only reduce the gas prices, but also make us less vulnerable to supply constrictions, right?
Right. Yeah. The recommendations all tied to, tax levels, environmental regulation, or this island effect situation, tied somewhat to the Jones Act. But all of these are very difficult to change. I mean, because they're really rooted in kind of this California environmental ethos that's very difficult to unpack. And we know what the drivers are. We know where the problems are, but in terms of changing that, that's very difficult to do because Californians tend to be very tied to strict environmental standards, and it's going to be difficult to change. I mean, even the taxes here in California are high, and some of the justification for that is, we're trying to discourage people from driving. So they want to keep the taxes high. It's not just because road repair is expensive in California, although it is.
It is,
It is, but also
it's not perfect either.
Also, it's meant to send a signal to people to cut back on your fossil fuel use and to drive less. So most of all of this is tied to environmental questions and what the standards should be and what the regulations should be. But one thing that we mentioned in the report and we hit on several times is that environmental justice, there's a flip side to it, and that is the impact of the higher prices really hit low income and moderate income families much more than higher income families. So we recommend that we revisit all of these three key drivers regularly to see have they become so stringent and overly burdensome that they're putting too much of the burden on low income people. And it's kind of a reverse environmental justice where people are paying a lot more at the lower end of the wage scale for fossil fuels as a percentage of their income. And as a result, maybe we need to reassess these and look at, what's really necessary, what's excessive, what's working, what's not. So those are good recommendations, and those are all in the forthcoming report.
What you said about that is a very, for most people, unexpected kind of analysis. The equity angle on the high social cost of high environmental restrictions and fees and so forth. Fascinating. I mean, the fact that you can think in new ways about California problems is one of the many reasons why I personally don't think that California is a lost cause by any means. We've got the resources, we've got some brain power, including here in our own California Golden Fleece team at the Independent Institute, to make sense of these things, do some serious research, come up with some real solutions, which could actually be acted on as people start thinking through it a little more carefully. And I just bet that Jonathan, Adam, and Lawrence, that there are people out there who would like to stand with you guys and help you keep this work up. What can they do to help support the California Golden Fleece Awards?
Well, people can participate in three ways. The first is please read the reports and share them with your friends and family and colleagues. I mean, that's the first and foremost, is to digest this information. And it's very accessible, but you'll come away with a really good, thorough understanding of these issues after you read them. The second would be to offer suggestions. So we have a portal on our website, on the Golden Fleece, California Golden Fleece website page, where you can click on a portal and you can send us your suggestions on future fleeces of, examples of waste, fraud, and abuse in California. Again, though, we're looking for those that can be verified and documented. So be prepared to share your best ideas and we'll follow up with them. And then the fourth way, of course, is on the website and just generally on independent.org to donate to our operations and the good work that's being done, not just with the California Golden Fleece Awards, but across all of our various programs.
Thank you so much, guys. I really appreciate the hard work you have done. You're going to make California a better place in the present and even more in the future. And I invite all of our friends to visit our website again that Lawrence mentioned, which is independent.org. Over on the top left, there's a button called About, and under there you'll find a direct link to the California Golden Fleece Award programs. So join us in this effort, and thanks for watching Independent Conversations. Take care, everybody.